Hi, and welcome back to the Law News Network. I'm Ken Belkin. I'm joined in the studio today by Ronn Blitzer, Senior Editor of Law News Network and a former prosecutor with the Kings County District Attorney's Office. That's Brooklyn for all you people outside of New York City. So, Ron, we've got an interesting case here. This man was convicted 30 years ago, and on appeal, it was sent back down to re-adjudicate whether or not the death penalty was properly imposed at the trial. Now, I ask you, how difficult is it from a prosecutorial standpoint to relitigate a case almost 30 years old?
It's certainly difficult. I mean, in my experience, it's been very tough in cases like that. For some of the more minor cases where you have a defendant. Like I've had cases where a defendant, and we're talking for like minor misdemeanors here, where a defendant disappeared for 30 years on a bench warrant and then finally gets picked up. And it's so hard that we've just dismissed cases at that point because there's not really much to do. This is a little bit different. This is a murder case where he's already been convicted. The conviction stands. There's still a lot of documentation. There's been past testimony, so there's a lot to go on here. So it's not impossible, but when you're talking 30 years in the past, you have people who were involved in the case who may be retired, people who may not be available. You have to go on recollections or notes that are decades old. Fortunately for the prosecution, they're not relitigating the merits of the case itself and trying to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt anymore. That's still standing. But when you're trying to relitigate, any portion of a case that's 30 years old, you have challenges, especially now, you have changes in the law regarding the death penalty in Nevada. So it's certainly not easy, but, they're going to have to just, stick to the facts that have been established already and show why the death penalty is still proper.
My understanding of the law in Nevada is that in order to get the death penalty imposed on a defendant, one has to argue that there were aggravating circumstances indicating some sort of depravity of mind. Now, you've been in the prosecutor's seat before. What is your strategy here? What is your method of attack to prove there were aggravating circumstances here?
Well, you look at the nature of the crime. This was, a stabbing, but not just, your typical stabbing. There were, dozens of stab wounds found on the victim's body. We heard, believe yesterday, from a medical examiner who was talking about the nature of the wounds, talking about how not just how many there were, but how they were grouped in different parts of the body in the same number, which he said was not common. He said it's not uncommon for there to be stab wounds in different parts of the body, if a victim is fighting, but to have groups of 8 in one spot, groups of 8 in another spot, groups of 8 in another spot, that shows that this was something that was being done deliberately and not just brutally, but with some sort of plan in mind, potentially. So I think you just go into the nature of the wounds, the nature of the acts, and let them speak for themselves.
Now, look, we know I'm a defense attorney, so I'm going to push back on you a little bit about the nature of the wounds. Now, there's been some evidence and testimony elicited that some of these wounds occurred post-mortem, meaning after she was dead. Now, given the fact that this is sort of a desecration of a corpse, a lot of these wounds, does that factor in and sort of detract from the aggravating circumstances in this case?
If anything, I think that it goes towards a prosecution's case about aggravating circumstances, showing that either Valerio just kept going even after she was already dead and just kept going because he wanted to make sure everything was done, or even worse, knowing that she was already dead, decided to continue desecrating the body. So I think if anything, that goes towards a prosecution's case of showing that there were aggravated circumstances.
Not sure I agree because, it can't really be torture if the person's already dead. But that being said, I'd like to take a look at a clip of James Vaccaro testifying to the nature and extent of the injuries and going through some of the photos of these very brutal injuries that this woman sustained.
My 9-year-old daughter at the time of the crime, and the testimony of the daughter has been introduced in this photograph of Santa Claus.
I can't remember. There was another picture I allowed of the mother and daughter.
And the ex-husband. There is a picture of those three together.
As an infant, and you ruled the other two were
Yeah.
inadmissible because she was an infant.
Yeah.
I would note that Kane v. Tennessee makes victim impact.
No, yeah, and that's why, you know, she was an infant and long before where there was an impact here. So, I mean, the fact that she had a relationship with her mother as an infant, I found to be somewhat tangential and repetitive to the issue here. But this is, you're saying, approximately the time that she was...
Correct. According to the trial transcripts, this is what she looks like at the time of, and that was the
right.
argument to the district court.
Anything else you want to add to your objection?
Your Honor, it's our understanding that the prior picture, well, let me ask you, was this picture introduced at the time of trial?
That is Exhibit 20 from the guilt phase that was introduced over objection of the defendant.
The last thing I would say, just the inclusion of a picture with Santa Claus, what we think is just unnecessarily and overly prejudicial and outweighs the probative value there.
Okay, I'll overrule and admit Exhibit 81. Anything else from the state?
Just as it relates to the defense case, at least for today, they intend to read in some testimony, and I assume they're going to call some family members as well. In reviewing that testimony, there are certain violations of a case that came out after this case called Kazmarek, and that site is 120 Nevada 314. In Kazmarek, the Nevada Supreme Court not only affirmed that a victim family can't ask for a particular punishment, but neither a defendant, defendant's family, or any other person can ask for a particular punishment in a capital sentencing phase because it's not relevant to the determination of this jury what their opinions are as to what the sentence should be. And so I would request that any read-in transcript be redacted to any references to, you know, please let my brother live, you know, if he dies, I die, those types of things that are now excluded pursuant to Kazmarek from victim families being, or defendant families being able to ask the jury.
Have you told them what transcripts you're going to be reading?
Your Honor, we have. We provided copies of those to them. So,
All right. I mean, I hate to be sitting here going, don't do any of that. You know, is there something in those transcripts you've got a particular concern about, Mr. Giacomo?
Yes, and in fact, the only one I have concern about is Jewel. There's a series of questions asked. Some of her answers are appropriate, but the question asked, and this is on page 44, so the very end of her testimony, it says, what do you think he will do with his life? What will he do if he's allowed to live? Answer, I think if you let my brother live, he can contribute to society because I know when I saw my brother, I saw him a little while ago, it hurt me. How do you think he can contribute to society? And she has an answer, some of which was admissible, but at the end she goes, because we all love him, all his family loves him, and if he dies, we die too. I'd ask that you redact that statement, and only that statement, to be honest with you. It's just that limited statement, which is clearly a plea to this jury not to kill her brother.
Mr. Everson?
Yeah, we would submit on that request.
All right, I'll strike the...
Her vehicle, as well as contained within the bedspread that was noted and relevant ultimately in the investigation.
Yes, here on the floor, it's a little blurry, but there are numerous pieces of gravel that people commonly refer to as pea gravel. It's a small gray substance that later became an important factor in the case.
Let's move on to State's Exhibit number 3. What are we looking at?
Here, the crime scene investigators, in the presence of probably the coroner's office at that point, are removed this wad of bedding material, which contained a human being, to this sterile sheet on the floor of the garage from the vehicle.
And once that is sort of unlayered, within that they find Karen Blackwell.
That's correct.
And she is in a pretty, well, how would you describe her state of decomposition?
We will see her as decomposing For some period of time, she's blackened and basically unrecognizable facially at that point.
Now, within that blanket, did the crime scene analysts collect a number of hairs, fibers, those type of things?
Yes, it's a slow process, and as the layers of the onion are peeled back, so to speak, the bedding becomes an evidence item, as well as fibers that are attached to it. And there were hairs that were associated with this bedding. Human hair, what appeared to be animal hair, and also more of this gravel that we just spoke about.
And so the jury can tie this up later. Was the crime scene analyst named Bob Rees?
Yes, he is one of them.
And then Bob Leonard, the detective, was also present as well during this process?
That's correct.
In addition to the hairs and fibers, was there a bloody sock found in the bedding?
Yes, there was. As I recall, it was sort of a athletic sock, if you might call it that. It had a ring, a colored ring on top of it. I think it was a red colored ring on the top of the sock.
Eventually, after they remove all these items and document all these things, putting up for you State's Exhibit number 4, do they then document sort of what the bedspread looks like?
Yes, once the victim's been removed from the bedding, things are slowly spread out so that they can examine them for maybe defects in the material or some type of trace evidence that's on the bedding. And here we have the bedspread stretched out for that examination and the photographs that were taken of it for evidence.
And lastly, before I leave this, the nature of the hairs that were found, there were blonde hairs, black hairs, as well as what appeared to be white and black animal hairs that were on all this bedding and blankets and stuff.
That's correct.
So once all of this is unraveled, as you said, peeled the onion, what happens to the body of Karen Blackwell?
Karen Blackwell is then right there in the crime lab, and in the presence of the mortuary that's responded and the coroner's office investigator. She's then placed into a body bag and placed into one of the vehicles to be transported to the coroner's office for an autopsy because this is an unattended death, or at least it seems to be a criminal matter, and a full autopsy is going to take place the following morning.
At an autopsy, who's present?
Well, typically we start with forensic assistants who will receive the body as it arrives at the coroner's office, and then they will prepare the body for autopsy by removing the body from the body bag. There are numerous photographs taken during this process. A seal that's on the body bag that was placed in the crime lab is removed by them, then photographed. All of this is for continuity of evidence. And then once the body is prepared and placed on a table, the body is brought into a separate room, and the process begins with the doctor being present, that forensic assistant who's also present, and typically one or both of the homicide detectives are there, along with crime scene investigators who are also documenting photographs. So you have two photographers in there. You've got your coroner's office taking photographs, and you've got your crime lab or our crime scene investigators taking photographs.
And the crime scene investigator that was at autopsy on this particular case was crime scene analyst Roger?
Yes.
So once the sort of the processing of the body goes through, you said there's a series of photographs taken, both when she's clothed, then when she's unclothed, and then to document the various injuries.
Yes.
May I approach?
Go ahead.
Detective, I'm going to show you what's
You
been
showed
marked.
these to Mr. Erickson, right?
I did. Showing you what's been marked as State Proposed Exhibit 5. Through 10, and then 12 through 19, and ask you to flip through those and see if you recognize what's depicted in those photographs.
Yes, I do.
Those appear to be autopsy photos taken of Miss Blackwell, from one where she's even clothed, and also demonstrating what her injuries were.
Yes.
And Judge, I would note that the numbers from the trial 88 and these numbers are the same. And I would offer 5 through 10 and 12 through 19.
Any objection other than those previously stated?
No, Your Honor.
All right, 5 through 10 and 12 through 19 will be amended.
Now, I'm going to start with State's Exhibit number 5 and ask you to describe what we're looking at here.
This is one of the first photographs taken after Karen Blackwell was removed from the body bag. And I can determine that by the fact that she still has clothing on. And it's part of the process prior to the actual autopsy beginning.
Can you tell us, because we don't have a photograph of what clothing she was wearing versus not wearing, can you tell us generally how she was dressed within that blanket?
Yes, she had sort of a bodysuit on that was sort of a thong style between the crotch, a one piece that went up through open arms and shoulder straps. So it was just one piece lace, white lace bodysuit.
Was her skirt ever found?
Not that I know of, no.
And was there a blouse off her body that was within the bedspreads as well?
Yes,
So she has this sort of one piece undergarment, for lack of a better term.
yes.
She obviously has some gold chains, and then within this photograph, there's an orange zip tie, for lack of a better term. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, this is a common thing. We see a plastic tie that's used in different things, industrial work, possibly refrigeration, to tie a ductwork together. And you slip one end through a ratcheting head on the strap, and then as you tighten it down, it holds whatever you're trying to hold in place, and it won't back out. It's a one-way deal. The only way to get it off is to cut it off.
And the description in the reports, as well as this photograph here, the tie doesn't appear to be tied down tight, as in a ligature type situation. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. It's loose.
It's loose. And the descriptions in the reports, as well as the autopsy, suggest there's no hemorrhage underneath there, like it was used as a ligature.
That's correct.
Madam Court Reporter, I'm going to have you flip over to this for 6 because on my computer it's not exactly the same shape. So now I'm going to move on to State's Exhibit number 6 and ask you, generally, what are we looking at?
This is a photograph, obviously, of a gloved hand during autopsy by probably the forensic assistant, holding a ruler for measurement of the size of the injury that we're looking at on the skull of the victim. We see that during decomposition, often human hairs will slough off the skin and just fall off by themselves. But it appears also that there's some shaving that took place here, so I can see shorter hair. And that would be so that the wound could be observed and measured properly.
And the reports reflect that this is blunt force trauma to the head of the victim.
Yes.
And when we use the term blunt force trauma, what are we talking about?
We have different types of trauma that can occur. In a blunt force trauma, you have a hard object that will cause the skin to split in ragged edges instead of an incised wound, which would show a more linear shape, like a knife would make. And so blunt force trauma is something hard hitting the flesh and creating the situation where it can burst open.
And so it appears that Karen Blackwell had hit her head, or someone hit her head with something hard, causing this laceration to the top of her head.
That's true.
In addition to that, Madam, we'll go back to my computer now. In addition to that, in exhibit number 7, did Miss Blackwell have 8 stab wounds to the top of her head as well?
Yes.
And this may be self-explanatory, but for the record, the difference between a blunt trauma versus a stab wound is what?
Well, basically, we have an instrument involved with the incised wound or the stab wound. And in this photograph, you can see on the top right of the damaged area, more of that linear shape that I've described that would indicate that a weapon or some type of a knife was used, something sharp was used to create that wound. And they are completely different in shape, and their margins are completely different than blunt force trauma.
And looking at the records, these stab wounds didn't penetrate the skull. Is that fair?
Yes, that's true.
And in your time as a homicide detective, stabbing somebody in the head and not penetrating through the skull, is that a very effective method of killing someone?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls the speculation.
Sustained.
Let me ask you this, in your time, how many times have you seen people with injuries to their head?
I have seen numerous injuries to the head.
Have you seen sharp force injuries to the head?
Yes, I have.
Have you seen sharp force injuries to the head that have not penetrated the skull?
Yes.
And sharp force injuries that have not penetrated the skull, in the times that you've seen them, have they usually resulted in the death of an individual?
No,
Objection,
no.
Your Honor. Once again, he's speculating. If it's supposed to be a summary witness testifying to a review of it, that's one thing. And him talking about other cases is another.
Yeah, I'll sustain that.
Let me move on now to State's Exhibit number 8. What are we looking at here?
Here we have a photograph with the assistant gloved hand pointing towards a wound that had a particular characteristic that the doctor, he wanted the doctor or she wanted the doctor to be aware of, along with our tape measure.
And so, and it's hard to see on these 1986 versions, but they appear to be documenting a stab wound behind the left ear of the victim.
Yes, you can see that the finger of the assistant there is holding the ear folded over and identifying that injury with the ruler very close to it.
And State's Exhibit number 9. What are we looking at?
Here we have our victim face down on the table now. We see a block that is used sort of like a 4-inch by 4-inch rubber block that's underneath the neck. And that's exposing the back side of the neck of the victim where additional what appear to be incised or knife-related wounds are in a cluster right where the shoulders and the bottom of the neck come together.
Now these particular wounds here were described by the medical examiner as stab wounds.
That's correct.
So some sharp knife-like object caused these particular wounds.
Yes, we can see the edges are defined, not ragged like in blunt force trauma, and they're in a cluster that is close together.
So now I'm going to flip to the front of her neck on State's Exhibit number 10. What are we looking at?
Here we have another small grouping of incised wounds. I believe it's in the neighborhood of 8, and they are also have the same characteristics with those smooth edges that would be from an incised wound.
The nature of the wounds in this particular place, the way that they are grouped together, and there doesn't appear to be sort of in and out, in and out, in and out without any deviation from it. Does that suggest anything to you?
In my experience, it suggests close
Your
quarters.
Honor, I would object.
That's
It's
it.
not offering his opinion as what it suggests to him. He's supposed to be articulating a summary of what the evidence from the coroner was.
Lay a little bit more foundation, but I'm going to let you go there. I think this is that we can indicate what the general nature of what the activity is that the person is safely engaged in.
And I'm going to get to this detective sort of in a broad view, but in particular on this, you said that you believe that this demonstrated that there was close quarters. Let me ask you, in the time that you've been a detective, when people are being stabbed and they are thrashing about trying to get away from it, do you get this type of grouping usually in your nature of your stab wound?
Not,
No, Oliver will.
not in those circumstances.
So this suggests that she's not moving at the time that she's receiving some of these grouped up injuries?
Yes.
Objection, no speculation.
Overruled.
State's Exhibit number 12. What are we looking at?
Here we have our victim head to the left, face up again, and we have a measure or small ruler placed on top of her body beneath her right breast, and that is there to document 8 additional incised close quarter stab wounds.
And then State's Exhibit number 13 documents the 8 to the left breast as well.
Yes, it does.
Now, State's Exhibit number 14. What are we looking at?
Here we have our victim, head to the right. The ruler is been laid upon her stomach, and it is documenting the incised wounds punctured in the abdomen area.
She has punctures in her stomach, and then number 15, does she also have a single puncture wound to her back?
Yes,
And that's documented in State's Exhibit number 15.
yes.
I'm going to skip 16 for just a second and now jump to 17, 18, and 19. As a detective, have you heard the term defensive wounds before?
Yes, of course.
Can you describe what that is?
Typically, these are injuries that we see our victims have, alive or deceased, that are their effort to prevent the damage from occurring to their body during an attack. They mostly happen on their hands and arms as they're trying to protect themselves during an attack.
And does Ms. Blackwell have at least a few defensive wounds?
Yes,
So let's start with 17. She has a wound to her left arm.
yes, this is her left arm. You can see her fingers in the top of the photograph, elbow to the left in the photograph.
She has a wound number 18.
Here we have another on the right hand. We see her fingers to the right, and the ruler's been placed up by her knuckle on top of her hand.
And then 19 is that the left hand.
And we have the left hand, and damage to the top of the hand as well.
Other than those that we've seen in these 3 photographs, those are the only defensive wounds she has, despite the 45 or so wounds to her body.
Well, that we could see with that level of decomposition. There could have been other bruising, contusions, or even
Objection,
abrasions.
speculation.
Sustained.
And finally, State's Exhibit number 16.
I'll sustain it, I'll sustain it after the answer to what we could see in the photographs. The remaining of the answer, all were stricken.
What are we looking at in State's Exhibit number 16?
Here we have a photograph of our victim, her upper body to the left of the photograph, and her 2 legs. This is her vagina area, and at the top of her pubic arch we have a ruler which has been placed to document the distance and the size of the damage by that incised wound that's right below the ruler, about a third of the way up.
So the victim has a stab wound that penetrates the labia majora and into her vagina.
That's what I understand from the report, yes.
Once sort of the autopsy is completed, in your standard everyday homicide case, how do you go about, or how do these detectives go about investigating the death of Ms. Blackwell?
Well, a lot of things start happening the second that the body is found. The location is important because then a canvass is started, people talking to people in the neighborhood where the vehicle's found, and in this case, it was at an apartment complex on South Maryland Park. Also, the car has a serial number and a license plate. So we try to determine who's the registered owner or owner of the vehicle, and then we work from that little area. We start working our circle out, trying to determine who is known associates with our victim once we've identified our victim, and then the ball just keeps rolling depending upon the direction it takes us.
At autopsy, are there fingerprints taken of Ms. Blackwell, and is she ultimately identified as Karen Sue Blackwell?
Yes.
Once you've identified your victim, do you do something which is called victimology?
Yes.
What is victimology?
Victimology is the study of the victim. Like criminology would be the study of a crime. And in victimology, we look into everything we can find out about our victim to try to determine what her world is like and who she's been involved with or encountered in the last period of time. We see this level of decomposition, so we know that we have a problem with time because we know that she's been deceased for a period of time. So that opens up that victimology a little bit more because we know we have a bigger range of time.
Ultimately, once they find out that it's Karen Blackwell, do they locate a missing persons report that was entered on September 21st of 1986?
Yes, in association with the running of the license plate on the car, the computer shows that there is a person listed as Karen Blackwell as a missing person associated with that very same vehicle.
And when they looked that up, the person reporting is a man by the name of Roger Blackwell?
Yes.
And who is Roger?
Roger Blackwell is the ex-husband of our victim, Karen Blackwell.
And did Roger and Karen have any children in common?
Yes.
Who was that?
They have at the time, a daughter that was 9 years of age, Summer Blackwell.
And do the police reach out and contact Mr. Blackwell to find out the circumstances of the missing report and what him and his daughter might know about the death of Miss Blackwell?
Yes, the detectives would interview the ex-husband as well as the daughter and learn more facts about the case.
Now, contained within the case file, were there some photographs of Miss Blackwell along with Roger in one of them, Summer in some of the other ones, of sort of what she looked like in life?
Yes.
I'm showing you what's been marked as State Proposed Exhibit 20, 46, 47, and 48. I can tell you if those appear to be photographs of Miss Blackwell in real life or in life before her death that were contained within the case file.
Yes, I recognize photographs.
We do have objections to some of those photos.
Okay.
Gonna offer.
I figure you're gonna offer. We need to have a sidebar?
Yes.
All right. I have those photos, please. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. You're watching the LawNewz Network. I'm Ken Belkin, filling in for Jesse Weber today. I'm here in the studio with LawNewz senior editor Ronn Blitzer, who's also a former prosecutor with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. Now, Ron, this man is convicted against some very egregious crimes, very egregious incident relating to a prostitute. Now, it's common knowledge in the criminal justice profession that people who are convicted of crimes against women and children are often subject to reprisals in jail. What has been your experience with people convicted of these crimes?
A lot of times people who are convicted of particularly egregious crimes, whether it's against like women or children, or if they're sexual in nature, they can be subject to some pretty bad treatment by other inmates in jail. It's sort of like a hierarchy where people convicted of certain crimes are treated worse.
Yeah, it's very strange. There seems to be in our penal system this, for lack of a better term, some sort of code of honor with respect to what crime you're convicted of. And certain crimes, you're afforded a certain amount of courtesy and politeness. I don't know if that's the correct word to use, but when it comes to crimes against women and children, your fellow convicts and your fellow inmates don't seem to take lightly to that.
There's definitely less respect afforded to people who commit certain crimes as opposed to others.
Well, Seeing as how this trial is starting late today, given that it is a Las Vegas, Nevada case and it's on the West Coast, and we at LawNewz are here on the East Coast, I'd like to take a look at some testimony from yesterday